Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my full review of the Canon RF 14-35mm f4L IS USM, an ultra-wide zoom lens for the EOS R mirrorless system. Announced in June 2021, it's the widest lens in the RF system to date and costs around $1,700 or pounds. Note that this lens will not work on EOS DSLRs or EOS M mirrorless cameras. Is designed only for EOS R cameras with their RF lens mounts. Canon's first ultra-wide lens for the EOS R system was the RF 15-35mm f2.8L, launched in August 2019 and seen here in the middle. Priced at $2,400 and weighing 840 grams, it's the heavyweight in both cost and heft. The RF 14-35 f4L, seen here on the right, arrived almost 2 years later, providing a smaller, lighter, and more affordable alternative costing $1,700 and weighing 540 grams. Both lenses are, however, premium zooms, so Canon followed them up with the budget-oriented RF 16mm 2.8 in September 2021. At just $299 and weighing 165 grams, this fixed focal length lens is a fraction of the size, weight, and price of the L zooms and brings ultra-wide goodness to a broader audience. While this review will concentrate on comparing the two L zooms, I'll also include a selection of side-by-side results against the budget 16mm to show how they differ in practice, as it could provide exactly what you need with a significant cost saving. If you find these direct comparisons with real-life subjects useful, please do consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks! Measuring 84 by 100mm and weighing 540 grams, the RF 14-35 f4L is a fairly compact zoom with optical stabilization, dust and moisture resistance, and a 77mm filter thread. At 89 by 127mm and weighing 840 grams, the RF 15-35 2.8L is wider, longer, and over 50% heavier. Like the f4L model, it also sports optical stabilization as well as dust and moisture resistance, but the larger aperture demands bigger 82mm filters. From the side of the 14-35, you can see the controls, starting off with a switch for auto and manual focus and another to turn the stabilization on or off. Note if your EOS R body has built-in sensor shift IBIS, this switch will also switch it on or off, as the optical lens IS currently works alongside it. The first ring operates the zoom, with the lens at its shortest physical length when set to around the 20mm focal length. As you adjust it towards 14 or 35mm at the extreme ends, the barrel extends a little by about 9mm. Next comes a smooth manual focusing ring, motor assisted like all native Canon RF lenses, followed by a customizable clicky RF control ring at the end. As a member of the L series, the lens is branded with a red ring at the end and supplied with a petal lens hood. For comparison, here's the RF 15-35 2.8L viewed from the side, where you can see, again, it's a much heftier proposition, and in use you'll really feel the difference in your hands and in your bag. Once again, the switches for focus and stabilization, followed by the zoom, manual focus, and custom control rings. Note how the focus and especially the zoom rings are wider on the 15-35 than they were on the 14-35, although they're similarly smooth to operate. And here it is with the supplied lens hood. Already, both zooms enjoy a number of key benefits over the budget RF 16 2.8, beyond the obvious ability to zoom of course and having optical stabilization. Like the budget RF 51.8 before it, the 16 2.8 has only one ring with a switch to set it between manual focus and custom control. Annoyingly, both of these lenses also require you to enter a camera menu to select manual focus, rather than simply flicking the AF/MF switch on the higher end models. There's also no weather sealing, nor any hood supplied in the box, and while the 43mm filter thread is much narrower than the L zooms, it's a fairly uncommon size that can be hard to find filters for, at least without using step-ups to bigger ones. Okay, now for my test, and I'm going to start with autofocus with the 14-35 on an EOS R5 body at 14mm f4 and in the single AF mode, where you can see the lens snapping into focus almost instantly. Next, with the lens zoomed to 35mm and still wide open at f4, and again you'll see the focusing snaps on pretty much the instant I push the shutter release button. Now this may be similar in speed to the RF 15-35, but both are visibly quicker, not to mention quieter at focusing than the RF 16, both of which you can see in action in my respective reviews of each lens. I'll show you movie autofocus later on in the video. Next for coverage, especially at the wide end, as that's what really differentiates these three lenses, and while the 14-35 genuinely delivers the widest field of view in the native RF series to date, it does rely on fairly significant distortion compensation that's applied either in camera for JPEGs or using profiles when converting RAW files. Whether this bothers you is a personal choice, but I'll briefly show you what's going on behind the scenes. First, here's what you'll get when shooting JPEGs with each lens using the default settings, starting with the RF 16mm, which has distortion compensation automatically applied for in-camera JPEGs. You can't turn this off for this lens. Next for the RF 15-35 at 15mm, which by default has distortion compensation disabled, as it's already pretty well corrected in this regard. Not perfect, as you'll see in a moment, but certainly by far the best of the three lenses here. And finally, the 14-35 at 14mm, where, like the RF 16mm, distortion compensation is applied automatically for JPEGs and can't be turned off. As you can see, each lens is capturing a progressively broader field of view for JPEGs out of camera, as you'd expect, even after compensation has been applied to the 16 and the 14-35. Once again, here's the 16, then the 15-35 at 15, and finally the 14-35 at 14mm. But now let's get interesting. So here's some RAW comparisons, starting with the 14-35 at 14mm with the lens corrections applied by the profile in Adobe Camera Raw, where the coverage is actually a tad wider than the in-camera JPEG corrections. A nice bonus for RAW shooters there. But now let's switch to the same RAW file with lens profiles disabled, and you can see exactly what image is being delivered by the lens to the camera before any corrections. This is the same lens at the same focal length on the same camera. In fact, it's the same image file. It's just that one has got corrections applied and this one doesn't. The uncorrected version is notably wider, but suffering from barrel distortion as well as vignetting in the corners. The latter is actually the edge of the imaging circle itself. Switching back and forth between the corrected and uncorrected RAW file illustrates what's going on behind the scenes with the 14-35, at least at 14mm. But as you'll see, even with the crop applied during compensation, it remains the widest of the three lenses compared here. Next up, the 15-35 at 15mm, and you're looking at a RAW file with the full correction profile applied in Adobe Camera Raw, where the result is roughly similar to the outer camera JPEG that I showed you earlier. And now for the RAW file with lens profiles disabled, where you'll see the lens is capturing a slightly wider field with a little barrel distortion and mild vignetting, but it's nowhere near as severe as the 14-35 when its profile is turned off. Switching between the RAW files processed with and without lens compensations on the 15-35 illustrates the difference between them is much more mild, and this unsurprisingly confirms the 15-35 as the best corrected of the three lenses here. And finally, here's the RF 16mm at 16mm, and again you're looking at a RAW file with the full correction profile applied in Adobe Camera Raw. But now here's the RAW file from the 16mm with lens profiles disabled, where again you're going to see significant distortion and vignetting in the corners. Again, switching between them shows you exactly how much correction is taking place with this lens behind the scenes. To better illustrate the geometric distortion that's been corrected by the profiles, here's a shot of my wobbly garden wall with the 14-35 at 14mm. It's an outer camera JPEG where the distortion compensation has been automatically applied already, and other than some pointing work that obviously needs to be done on the wall, it's looking fairly normal. But now for the RAW version, where I processed it without compensation to show what the actual optics are delivering to the sensor, and there's pretty significant distortion here. Perhaps more than you would have expected for a member of the L series that cost $1,700. For comparison though, here's the uncorrected RAW version from the RF 16mm, which has even more extreme distortion, although it is of course a considerably cheaper and non-L series lens. And finally for the RF 15-35 at 15mm, again the RAW version with compensation disabled, where it too is showing some barrel distortion, but far less than the other two. This again confirms it as the best corrected of the three to start with, although again unsurprising given its size, weight and price. Now software corrections have become part of modern lens design, and it allows smaller, lighter, cheaper or more extreme options to be made. Purists may prefer an entirely optical solution, but this will inevitably result in a larger, heavier and more expensive lens. It's your choice at the end of the day. Personally speaking, I'm now just about at peace with lens profiles, as it's all about the end result rather than the journey to get there, although it is important to remember that the more pixel wrangling you need to do to get an image into shape, the greater the hit on the resolution will be. And you'll inevitably notice this most in the corners, so the question becomes, what is acceptable for you? To help you decide, I'll now compare the sharpness of the two L zooms for my distant peer scene, angled so that details run into those corners. I always say this, but these outdoor comparisons of distant subjects with multiple lenses across various focal lengths do take a lot of work, but I feel they're essential in a lens review. So if you like what I do, give me a like and a follow. Not too much to ask, is it? Okay, so let's start here with the 14-35 f4L at 14mm f4 on the EOS R5 body. These are all JPEGs out of camera with the default settings, so that's distortion compensation enabled for the 14-35 and off for the 15-35. And if you'd like to see how the budget RF 16mm compares with this distance scene, do check out my separate review of that lens. Taking a close look at the centre of the frame, which is where the lens was focused, reveals fine details out of the gate with no significant benefit to sharpness or contrast as you stop down. Heading out into the corner shows the 14-35 does become a tad softer than in the middle of the frame at f4, but again this is when the lens is focused in the centre, and I'd say the result is still pretty respectable. If I close the aperture one stop to f5.6 and again to f8, there's a fractional improvement in sharpness but nothing significant. So you're getting close to the maximum performance from this lens with it wide open, and remember this is also with all of that software compensation and pixel wrangling taking place. Maybe not as bad as you thought it would be, right? Let's return to the close-up of the centre of the 14-35 at 14 f4 and compare it against the 15-35 2.8 on the right, here at 15mm 2.8. I'd say they're both looking quite similar here, although once their apertures are matched, the 15-35 on the right is arguably a tad superior if you're really pixel peeping. Not much in it at this point though. Now let's compare the corners of both lenses at their widest focal lengths and maximum apertures. In this comparison you'll see the 14-35 at f4 on the left slightly outperforming the 15-35 at f2.8 on the right, but if you close the latter lens by one stop to f4, I'd say it takes the lead in ultimate detail, and this edge is maintained as both their apertures are matched and closed down further. This could be due to superior optics, less digital compensation, or perhaps more likely a combination of both. Okay, next for the 14-35 f4L, roughly midway through its range at 24mm and wide open at f4, and again focused in the centre of the frame. Taking a close look at the middle again reveals sharp details and only minor boosts to contrast if you stop down further. Moving out to the corner of the f4 image, the 14-35 is managing to maintain sharpness pretty well at the 24mm focal length, even with the aperture wide open. Closing the aperture to f5.6 and then to f8 doesn't seem to make any significant improvements here. Returning to the middle of the frame with the 14-35 at 24mm f4 on the left and the 15-35 at 24mm f2.8 on the right, I'd say they're looking pretty similar. As I match the apertures and then gradually stop down, I'd say the 15-35 enjoys a mild benefit in contrast, but it is subtle. Both lenses are performing very well here. Next, back out to the corner where we can now directly compare the two lenses with matched coverage, and there's a little softness on the 15-35, perhaps due to coma when it's wide open at f2.8, which remains just visible when close to f4, but as both lenses are closed to f5.6 and then f8, the 15-35 becomes crisper overall with finer details. So if you are able to close the aperture a little, the 15-35 will give you better corner performance at 24mm, perhaps again due to less pixel wrangling. And finally for the 14-35 f4L at its longest focal length of 35mm and wide open at f4. Taking a close look in the middle of the frame where the lens was focused again shows very crisp details. Closing the aperture down won't get you any sharp details, but may improve the contrast a little. As you move out into the corner, the 14-35 remains respectably sharp at its longest focal length, and even wide open at f4 there's little to complain about. This time, stopping down to f5.6 and then to f8 does little to improve what's already excellent performance out of the gate. Returning to the middle of the frame with the 14-35 at 35mm f4 on the left, and the 15 to 35 at 35 2.8 on the right again shows a very similar looking result, with little benefit to stopping down other than a mild boost in contrast. Heading back out to the corners with both lenses at 35mm and set to their maximum apertures reveals a little softness again to the 15 to 35 on the right when it's at f2.8, but once close to f4 to match the 14 to 35, the overall detail becomes similar. And as their respective apertures are closed further, I'd say the 15 to 35 on the right takes a mild lead in overall crispness and contrast, but they are fairly close here. Okay, next for a quick portrait test to compare the subject sharpness and background rendering, starting with the 14 to 35 at 35mm f4. Taking a closer look shows bitingly sharp detail around my eyes and some blurring in the background, although unsurprisingly at 35mm f4 and from this distance there's never going to be that much separation. So how much difference could you expect from the 15 to 35 with its extra stop of aperture? Here's the full 14 to 35 image once again, and now for comparison let's switch it out for the 15 to 35 at 35mm 2.8 from the same distance. There is a little more blurring, but not a huge difference when viewing the full image. Taking a closer look with the 14 to 35 at f4 on the left and the 15 to 35 at 2.8 on the right reveals the differences in rendering. The bokeh balls from the f2.8 lens are definitely larger, but I'd say with more defined outlining, which is not always desirable, although both lenses are undeniably pin sharp on the focused areas. Swapping the 2.8 version on the right for one taken at f4 roughly matches the size of the blurred areas from the 14 to 35 on the left, but I'd still say there's a softer style to the 14 to 35, which I personally find preferable. How about you? To see the differences in rendering at close range with bokeh balls, here's the 14 to 35, again at 35mm f4 and near to its closest focusing distance. There's very mild textures within the bokeh balls, but it's not too distracting and there's not much outlining to complain about either. Let's now switch that image out for the 15 to 35 at 35mm 2.8, where you'll see the subject is a little more magnified at the same distance and the bokeh balls are unsurprisingly larger. But as we saw in my portrait example, they also have quite defined outlining, which may or may not be to your taste. Here's the 14 to 35 on the left at f4, and the 15 to 35 on the right at 2.8, where their differences in rendering style has actually become quite obvious. Do you have a preference? Now let's swap in the 15 to 35 at f4 on the right to match the aperture of the 14 to 35 on the left, and finally them both close to f5.6. At the other end of the aperture scale, you can achieve nice crisp diffraction spikes with the 14 to 35, here at 14mm f22, although as always you'll need to keep that front element and the sensor itself meticulously clean to avoid marks, which I didn't. And for good measure, here it is at 35mm f22. Okay, now for video performance, starting with autofocus on the 14 to 35 at 14mm f4 on the EOS R5, where it smoothly racks between near and far without issue. And now for the lens at 35mm f4, where again the R5 has no problem refocusing it between near and far without overshooting. The focusing is also very quiet. And now for a quick face tracking test, first with the 14 to 35 at 35mm f4, again on the EOS R5, which tracks me no problem. And for comparison, the 15 to 35 at 35 2.8, where again the tracking is absolutely fine, and you can see the differences in rendering from the earlier stills. While we're on the subject of focusing, how about breathing when the magnification can actually change as you refocus? Here's the 14 to 35 at 14mm, focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again. And for comparison, the 15 to 35 at 15mm, again focusing from infinity to the closest and back again. Both lenses actually increase their field of view or become wider as they focus closer, but the 15 to 35 showed a bigger variance here. Next, here's the 14 to 35 at 35mm, again focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again, where again the image becomes wider as you focus closer. And likewise for the 15 to 35 at 35mm, again focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again. So both lenses exhibit changes in magnification as they focus through their ranges. And finally a vlogging test, as ultra-wide angles are always popular for this kind of thing, starting with the 14 to 24 at 14mm f4 with IBIS in the R5 and optical stabilization in the lens working together. There's currently no way to turn off one or the other. You either have them both or you have neither of them. Next, for the same lens and camera, but this time with additional digital movie stabilization applied, where there looks like a mild crop, but some of that warping at the edges has been reduced. Now this works alongside IBIS on the Canon bodies and also with optical stabilization if your lens has it, which this one does. So you're looking at 3 different stabilization techniques all working together here. And now with digital movie IS set to the enhanced option, where there's an even more significant crop, making that 14mm look, well, a bit more like a 24mm at arm's length here. But for handheld walking and talking, the result looks the best of the 3 examples. Let's go back to that IBIS and optical IS version only before switching it for the 15-35 at 50mm 2.8. So it's a fraction less wide, but an extra stop of aperture brighter, allowing slightly greater subject separation here. Although it's not a huge difference, and both lenses suffered from warping at the edges when stabilised with IBIS and optical IS on the R5, at least when I was walking with them. Now your mileage will of course vary depending on the way you hold the camera and where you're walking with it, so here's one more comparison, still handheld but much more gentle, starting with the 14-35 at 40mm f4, where those warping artifacts have mostly been banished. And now for the 15-35 at 15mm 2.8, again showing slightly more blurring behind me. Now in my tests with different systems, I'm finding that digital stabilization alone is working best for walking vlogs, so I hope that Canon allows us at some point in the future to select exactly which stabilization techniques are applied, rather than just forcing them all on us simultaneously, which doesn't always give the best result, at least for vlogging. Okay, now it's time for my final verdict, during which I'll show you a selection of images taken with this lens. And if you'd like to view them more closely, the originals are all available via my review of the lens at cameralabs.com. The Canon RF 14-35 f4L is a flexible, high-quality, ultra-wide zoom that provides a compelling alternative to the RF 15-35 2.8. It sacrifices one stop of aperture to become smaller, lighter, and roughly 2/3 the price, while also capturing fractionally wider coverage. Like the 15-35, it has optical stabilization and is a member of the L series, which means you get nice smooth control rings, quick and quiet focusing, weather sealing, and a lens hood in the box. In my tests, it delivered very good results with crisp details across the frame, wide open and throughout the range. It does however rely on substantial software correction through lens profiles applied automatically to JPEGs in camera or during RAW processing. Now, in use you may actually never be aware of the processing taking place behind the scenes, but the optically superior 15-35 requires much less geometric correction, or in some cases can actually get away with none at all, and as such it boasts slightly crisper corners at the wide end due to less pixel wrangling. But of course it's also larger, heavier and more expensive. There's no doubt the 15-35 should outperform the 14-35 in pure optical terms, but equally, while the 14-35 does cost comfortably less, it's still not exactly cheap, and it may come as a surprise to discover just how much correction this member of the prestigious L series is relying on. Indeed, if you're considering the 14-35 simply as a lighter and more affordable ultra-wide option, there's also the budget RF 16 2.8 to weigh up. Sure, it's in a completely different league, much more basic and relying on even stronger corrections, but at just $300, it'll give you a taste of the exotic without the cost of either of those L zooms. I said it in my review of that lens and I'll say it again here, it really is a no-brainer for EOS R owners. Ultimately though, it's great to have the choice of 3 ultra-wide options in the native RF mount, and for many, the range, build quality and positioning will place the 14-35 in the sweet spot. And that's it for another lens review. If you found it useful, you can treat me to a like, a follow, or even a cup of coffee. Or perhaps treat yourself to my in-camera book, or maybe even a Camera Labs t-shirt or mug. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.